This is Uncommonly Remarkable. We have surprisingly casual discussions about the lives and notable accomplishments of community leaders, entrepreneurs, and everyday folks like you and me. Think of this podcast as an opportunity to learn something new and to pick up on an entrepreneurial tip or two through open conversation. I'm Artis Beatty. I'm a doctor of optometry and the chief medical officer for My Eye Doctor OD. Though we will inevitably touch on topics within my area of expertise, the opinions and conversations held here are separate from my work with My Eye Doctor. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is George Haymaker, a neuroscience educator and coach who brings lived experience, deep compassion, and scientific clarity to the conversation around transformation. After overcoming addiction and emotional pain rooted in childhood trauma, George discovered the power of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself for healing and change. In this episode, we unpack how our mental patterns form, how they can be reshaped, and why real, lasting growth starts by understanding how the brain actually works. If you've ever felt stuck or wondered why change is so hard, this one's for you. Ladies, gentlemen, all you remarkable people, please welcome George Hayman to the show. George, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you with us today. We've got a lot to talk about, and you have such an interesting story. And so I want to really thank you so much for spending some of your time with us, because I think there's a lot of pieces of this that are going to be important for people to hear and maybe really even help people who are thinking or need some help with some thoughts around the way their brains are actually functioning.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And, I wouldn't want to do anything else on a Saturday morning and talk some neuroscience. So great to be here. Thanks for having me. I love neuroscience. So let's go.
Fair enough. So why don't we start there? Because maybe for the listener, trying to think about what neuroscience is and what does that have to do with them is a really good place to start.
Yeah, so that word does tend to scare people a little bit. The way I like to think about it is that I'll give myself as an example, is I just never understood that, we have a lot more involvement and control over the outcomes of our brain than we realize. I just always went through life, for the first 50 years of it anyway, thinking that my mind was what it was, and I just kind of had to take what it was giving to me. And I couldn't have been more wrong. And so it turns out that our brain is merely a reflection of who we are and all the experiences that we've ever had. And then it organizes itself in terms of how the neurons map themselves out in our brains according to these experiences. So there's no two people in the world that have the same mapping in their brains, because everyone's experiences are different. And by experiences, I mean, all the thoughts that we've ever had, all the emotions, all the actions, all the behaviors, everything that travels through our mind represents these experiences, and our brain kind of responds and maps itself out in response to these experiences. So that's how our brains get to be how they are. And there's, 85 billion neurons in our brain, which are the brain cells, and they form these connections and form these patterns based on our past. The good news is that if we find ourselves in a place in life where we're not overly happy with what's going on in our minds, or we have unhelpful patterns, or we just, have negative thoughts, recurring thoughts, heightened emotions that are negative, reactivity, we react and perform behaviors that we're not happy with. Let's say we're quick to anger and we just can't seem to control it. So all of those are patterns that have been developed over time, and by re-engaging and reinforcing them time and time again, they get stronger and more ingrained in our brains. The good news is that the brain is plastic, it's forgivable, and it can rearrange itself, because if it arranged itself from our past the way it is today, then it can just as easily arrange itself differently for the future. And so that's called neuroplasticity, and it's the brain's magic ability to change, adapt, and evolve. The factor here, though, that's critical is that we have to engage and lead the way. The brain doesn't lead us, we have to lead the brain, and then it will follow. So that's The good news is that if we're stuck in things currently that aren't serving us well and aren't helpful, then we can change, and our brain will adapt and evolve.
I think this concept of neuroplasticity is one that has come to the forefront fairly recently in a lot of conversations, from thinking about addiction to depression. There is a lot of research and some really studied information around neuroplasticity and this ability for us to remap, rewire, and change patterns of behavior based on brain remodeling. And so one of the things that you talked about initially was you thought that the brain was doing what the brain was going to do for the first 50 years. So can you talk a little bit about the before times, before you really understood neuroscience as you do today? Talk about your career and what got you to this point.
Yeah. So a lot of, well, all of our patterns, I mean, we're born with some genetic predisposition, so some mapping in the brain. But then as soon as we're born, we start to experience life, and these patterns continue to either develop and form, or some of the ones we were born with begin to shift and change.
Hmm.
And that's this whole concept of the brain being plastic and shifting based on our experiences. So if we're brought up in, like my upbringing, just as an example, which kind of starts the story, was privileged financially, but it was unsettling in many ways. And so, like many people that have different types of upbringings, our brains begin to pattern themselves differently based on those experiences. And so, what
Hmm.
we're all trying to do as children and infants is meet our psychological needs. So that we have some basic psychological needs as humans. And in order to meet those needs, we're in whatever environments we're in. And, we have to develop patterns and constructed behaviors and so on that help us meet those needs. And so one person that's in a very loving, supportive environment growing up will meet their needs one way. Oftentimes they just get they get those needs met for them. Other people that grow up in more unsettling environments have to figure out how to meet their needs on their own.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that's how these patterns and constructs in our brain begin to develop. And what happens is we just keep reinforcing those patterns because we have to keep acting them out over and over again to keep meeting our needs. And so if you grow up in a difficult environment and you're having to meet your needs in, let's say, unhealthy ways that are causing you negative emotions and thoughts, many times we'll just carry those patterns with us into adulthood. And they'll continue to, and over the years, we just continue to, because that's what we've learned how to do to meet our needs. We
Yeah.
just continue to reinforce them over and over again. And now we're adults, and we're still trying to meet those needs from way back when in the same ways, and they're not healthy. And so, in my case, I had to move a lot in and out of environments. It was always unsettled, having to say goodbye to friends, meet new friends. I just never got comfortable. I got spanked a lot and some other forms of physical discipline. There was some sexual abuse from some older boys in a neighborhood where I grew up. I went away to boarding school in ninth grade. My parents moved overseas. So I was trying to meet my needs in some unhealthy ways. And I got angry a lot, very defensive, hypersensitive. I didn't feel worthy, just really uncomfortable, full of anxiety. So I developed these patterns. I carried them with me into adulthood, and I was still trying to meet my needs in the same ways I was as a child. And,
Mm.
um, and it just was very uncomfortable mentally for me, quick to anger, very defensive, hypersensitive. And that's how I conducted my adult life. It wasn't serving me well in business or in relationships. And I started to cope with addictive substances to ease the discomfort. And so that was kind of how I led my life. I also had a lot of addiction in my family, and there's some hereditary components to that. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I grew up. I was driven to succeed because that helped prove my worth. But had some other very uncomfortable ways of dealing with life. And so that's how I progressed in my adult life until addiction got the better of me and it started to overcome me. In my early 50s, I hit a hard bottom from excessive pain pill and alcohol abuse because addiction is very progressive. And if we're not aware of what's happening, it grabs a hold of us and it's hard to come back from. Yeah, and so I hit a bottom in the early 50s and I had to go to rehab and look myself in the mirror and decide that I was tired of living life that way and I wanted to figure out how to do it differently. And so that started a process of about 12 years now, where a lot of introspection, a lot of discovery, a lot of research and education about what had happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
I felt I was so transformed by what I began to learn and the new experiences I was having, becoming different, shaping a new identity, that I just felt like I wanted to bring that magic to other people and help them with their struggles and figure out how to transform themselves. And so that's what in the research and education, everything traces back to the brain. And so that's what led me to neuroscience, is because all of these things that are going on reside in the brain. And so it helps to really understand how the brain functions, how all these things are formed in our brains, how they can change. And so, yeah, I just became fascinated with the subject, and there's no greater juice I got out of life than watching someone else transform out of their struggles.
So you said a couple of things that I think we want to pull apart and just kind of bring them to the forefront. The first, thinking about your childhood and growing up, there are a list of things that would make it difficult. And there are, I guess, are several paths you can take. One of those paths would be to be the troubled child that really does not find success because they're dealing with all these things. Versus, you said that it drove you to succeed, which I think is very interesting, because driving the drive to succeed helped to prove your worth. Can you talk a little bit about that drive for success and how how maybe your experience helped to mold that piece and drive you towards success in the companies and your entrepreneurial spirit and the things that you were building?
Yeah, so again, it all traces back to these needs that we're trying to fulfill. One of the core psychological needs that everyone has is for significance and competence. And so, and we all have the same basic 6 psychological needs. We just have them in different proportions. They mean different things to different people. And so my dad was a high achieving corporate climber. And so I had him as a model.
Mm.
And so I wanted to be him. I idolized him. And part of the disconnect or frustration was, I just loved him so dearly and wanted to be like him and be as successful as him. But then he was punishing me as I was acting out because I was unsettled. And so that really caused a lot of attachment issues and the desire to find significance for myself. So, and then the other part that contributed to be an entrepreneur is that, as I said, I moved a lot, so I had to be self-sufficient.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I went away to boarding school. My parents moved overseas. So from 9th grade on, I was kind of fending for myself. And so that develops a lot of independence, and autonomy, which you need as an entrepreneur. And so those things shaped the patterns within me. And so I worked for a large company from out of college until 30. And I just finally had this realization that I just didn't want to work for other people. I didn't like listening to them. I didn't think that they knew any better than me. And so I just had this drive to create my own destiny. And that comes from those early days of needing to find my own significance, needing to prove myself, needing to be autonomous, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so that served me very well in the sense that I was driven to make my own destiny and to find significance through business to try to achieve what my dad had achieved. So that served me well. There were other things that other patterns I developed along with it that didn't serve me well, such as, being quick to anger, being hyper defensive, not connecting well with people because I had grown up in so many different environments. I didn't want to be hurt because I constantly had to say goodbye to friends early on. So I just kind of
Mm-hmm.
withdrew. And so, as you know, in business, like, you need to relate well with people. So that was an aspect of building my own businesses that was difficult, is that connecting with other people, your employees, and developing those bonds, right?
Sure.
I was highly demanding of myself, highly demanding of them. I couldn't understand why they wouldn't perform as I was. So there was kind of a amalgam of different patterns that accompanied me into that journey, some of which served me well, some of which didn't.
And so when you're thinking about where you began with remodeling or thinking differently about brain function, did you look at yourself and evaluate, these are things that I think are good about the way I'm structured, and these are things that I think are bad about the way I'm structured? How did you approach it?
I wish I had, I would have, avoided some pain and discomfort. Unfortunately, again, I was of the mind that I wasn't aware that the mind could change, or that I needed to change, or I didn't even know that things could be different, or how they would be different. Or I just didn't, I was so driven and so focused on finding significance for
Mm.
myself that I kind of had blinders on. And so I just went through life that way without really even taking into account. I was successful enough, so I guess I just always assumed that, well, I must be doing something right. It's not that I didn't even think about, well, these are things I could do better.
Yeah.
Um, until and until I knew that I had to change. I got to a point in life, overwhelmed by addiction, where everything had come to a head. And the first thing I had to do was break the addiction. But then I began to discover there were a lot of underlying patterns that had caused me to use substances. And so that's what people in recovery have to do, is they have to break the cycle, the pattern of
Oh, I
addiction.
see.
But then they have to go underneath and say, well, why was I using and drinking in the first place? Because happy people don't ordinarily become addicts. It's the people that are trying to cope and deal with discomfort in their mental lives that generally will cope with substances. And so that was the point then, hitting that bottom where the consequences had really piled up high, that I began to examine everything and really started to open my mind and take into account all kinds of possibilities. Up until then, I was driven, I had blinders on, and I just did not. And I think that's not, I might have been more tunnel vision than the average person, but I
Hmm.
think a lot of people don't change because they don't understand that they can and don't know how to go about it. And also, the impetus to change. What is the catalyst that's going to actually cause you to change? Are you just going to wake up one day and decide to change? Or, especially if you don't know how or that it's possible?
Right.
Or are you going to wait until the consequences are super high? Maybe your spouse leaves you because, you're just not, you don't have a healthy relationship with them. I mean, what is it that's going to cause you to actually change? And so that's the thing I hear from a whole lot of people, is that, they just feel stuck. And it's that
Yeah.
sense of stuckness that maybe we can talk about in a minute, that I think just keep people where they are.
Well, and I think we should talk about that, right? Because I would love for us to maybe walk through a few of the elements that you think about as you've maybe hit this turn point, right? So we'll assume that there was some external factor that triggers you to say, "This is not where I want to be. I want to do differently." And so, if you've hit that spot, then how did you think through, or how would you think through the next step or two, and how does that really relate from a neuroscience perspective to the way the brain is functioning?
Yeah, the brain is what, when people feel stuck and change feels hard, the neuroscience, the reason neuroscientifically behind that is that the brain is designed for predictability. So the brain's number one job is to predict the future, survey our landscape, the environments that we're in, conserve resources, predict the future in the interest of keeping us safe and in survival. That's it. That's what the brain's job is. It's not to figure out how to make more money to buy a nicer house. It's simply to predict the future in an ever-changing world, conserving as many resources as possible, because the brain has a lot of work to do every day. It's a 3-pound organ, but it consumes 25% of our calories. So it's got a lot going on. So it runs on predictions. It's constantly analyzing what's happening in the moment to determine how we should think, feel, and act in the moment. It doesn't wait to analyze everything to the nth degree. It's bringing thoughts and emotions and ideas of actions to our brain based on predictions from how we've done things in the past, okay? The brain then, in the interest of conserving resources, likes to keep things predictable, likes to stay where it is. Because again, its interest is keeping you in safety and survival so that you can have babies and continue the species. It's all about evolution. And so when you begin to think about change feels very overwhelming because the brain doesn't recognize this idea of change. It doesn't like it because it's not predictable. And so you start maybe even contemplating trying to change out of your patterns that you're in. Your brain doesn't want to go there because it just knows that what you've been doing, even if it's not comfortable, it's predictable, okay? Yeah. So that's what feeling stuck is neurologically, is the brain's resistance to wanting to experience anything that it doesn't know anything about, okay? And so to me, and that's why my title is neuroscience educator and coach, is because I think the best first step is education about, okay, how does the brain function? What is possible in it? And how do I get it to go from point A to point B? Because I don't know about you, but until I understand how something works, it doesn't make sense to me, or I don't want to go about doing it. Like learning how to play golf. Like I need to understand like the concept of what is the golf swing trying to do in order to get the ball to go further and straighter. I like to know the whys, hows, and wheres because it helps me buy in and it gives my mind a mental framework and picture in which to operate. So if I just told you to change and you had zero idea like what we're trying to do here, like what's the concept? How do I get there? That's why the brain is so resistant, is because it just has no concept. So if we begin to understand how everything works and what the path is going to look like, detail the process for me, then you can begin to say, okay, now I understand. Now I can get my head around that. Now I understand it's probably going to take me, 90 days to really transform my way of being, but I can buy into 90 days and here's the roadmap that gets me from here to there. And this is what's going to be happening in the brain along the way. Okay. Now I can get my head around it. There's a plan, right?
Yeah.
And so I really think that that's a helpful first step. And where I lead with education is shedding light on what it is we're trying to do here and what's possible. And then that helps open people's minds, and then they're willing and their brain becomes willing and accepting to learn more and begin this journey because they have an understanding.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think I've heard you explain this process very similarly to having a big well-rooted tree in a garden versus planting a new tree, and having to get yourself around. You plant the new tree, you have to nurture it versus what's happening with the old tree that you can't really do much with. And I think that analogy meant it was very easy to understand because we've all dealt with this kind of old work, new work type thing where you've got something that's very well established. It is a behavior, it's a habit, it's an addiction, and trying to manage that thing can be very difficult. And at some point you decide, I can't manage that thing. I got to have a new thing and I need to transfer over to the new thing. And I think that's very pertinent and probably very similar to maybe how you think about that whole process.
Yeah. Would you like me to elaborate on that
Yeah, I
metaphor?
would love that. I would love that.
Okay. Let's just think of our mental life as it is now, as an old tree in our backyard. And, this tree has been there for however many years you've been alive. And it started off as a really small tree and it grew and developed over time based on all of the experiences that you've had in your life. And so there are certain roots of that tree which are thicker and more well developed than other roots of the tree. And those thicker, more developed ones are the patterns in your life that you keep reinforcing over and over again.
Mm.
Some of them may be healthy, some of them may be unhealthy. I like to think of the unhealthy ones are the ones that are now coming out of the ground and going underneath your patio and starting to lift up your patio, which and those cracks in your patio that you're now looking at, knowing you're going to have to spend money on and fix, are equivalent to consequences in your life. Okay, they're the cracks in your life. And so what we want to do then is if we're tired of that tree pulling up our patio and we're at the point where we're willing to bring forward the motivation and commitment and acceptance and awareness of the issues, and then the motivation and commitment to even talk about the change that needs to happen, then what we want to do is then begin to envision a new way of being for ourselves, a new identity. What happens over our lifespan is that those needs that we talked about that we're born with, those psychological needs, they're still there, but they have shifted and changed over time. So it's almost like the foundation of the house has begun to shift and change as we've gotten older and life
Mm.
happens. Maybe earlier in life, certain things were more important to us than they are later in life. Like maybe earlier in life, significance and trying to prove ourselves is more important. And later in life, like connectedness, being with people and togetherness is more important. So what happens is that different things are more important to us later in life. And that's why we're uncomfortable, is because the patterns that we have in our life are no longer meeting our needs. And so what we want to do is plant a new tree that more fully aligns with how our needs are being met. So a new identity that's built on our values, built on our strengths, aligned with our beliefs, so that everything is congruent. There's nothing misaligned. And that is like a new tree, or you used the word remodel earlier on. I like that also, where you've grown up in this house for many years,
Hmm.
and the house, you've grown out of it. It's just not working for you anymore. The layout, maybe it's like 3 stories and you're getting older and you don't want to climb the stairs anymore. So the house is not working for you anymore. And so we're going to go over here and begin to design a new house and begin to lay the foundation. The foundation is our psychological needs. And then we're going to begin to construct our identity on top of the foundation. I'm sorry, I'm mixing metaphors here, um, but we're going to just try to design a new way of being that meets our needs better. Okay, and what that will involve is a whole new set of thought patterns and emotional patterns and behavioral patterns that are in line with this identity. So let's say we've lived a life and we've been too activated. Our nervous system's too activated. We get angry easily. We're hyper defensive. I'm talking about myself here, hypersensitive. And I got to a point where I just said, enough is enough. That's not serving me well. It's ruining my relationships. People don't like me. I'm going to design the new way that I'd like to be. And I'm going to begin to integrate new thought, emotional, behavioral practices that align with that identity. And I begin to practice those. So just like you would practice any new thing that you're learning, any new skill, you never got good at it overnight. You don't go to the gym and all of a sudden you get buff 3 days later. Like, you've got to be in there 4 days a week regularly and then ultimately you see results. If you learn a new language, you don't get to be fluent in a week. You have to work at it. Repetition. A new sport, same thing. So training our mind, becoming a different version of ourselves, having new thoughts, emotions, and behaviors is the same thing as learning anything else new. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because learning anything new, the language or the sport or the instrument, happens in our brain, right? All that stuff is encoded in the brain as we learn it.
Absolutely.
And so why wouldn't learning how to be a different person be the same thing? And it is.
Well, and
So,
that was going to be one of my questions for you, really, because we think about a lifetime then of this tree growing, because I like to think about the tree, and so now you've got this giant thing that's 30, 40, 50 years old. How reasonable is it to expect that you're going to be able to make significant change? And how do you think about the timeline on that, right? So you don't necessarily want to think, oh my goodness, this tree's grown for 50 years. I'm going to need 50 more years to grow a new tree. And so how do you think about that from a timeline perspective, and wrapping your brain around the changes that need to be made in a more timely fashion?
okay. So let's say that you decided you wanted to change, and then we spent some time together, or you spent time on your own identifying who this new person was that you wanted to be, how you're going to act, feel, and behave, your values that were going to be front and center, your the psychological needs you're going to try to meet, your belief systems, and so on. And you laid it out and designed it like a blueprint. Okay. So what's gonna happen then is that we are going to design daily life structures that are going to be in alignment with that new person. And really, what I have people do is even draw a picture of what that person's going to look like. I have them
Mm.
practice like how great it's going to be when they become that person. Like, what are the emotions they're going to feel, and so that they can begin to wire that image in their brains. And that's how these patterns are actually started form in the brain, is visualizing them. And just every time you visualize something, counts as a repetition. And so repetitions are what the brain likes. The muscles like repetition in the gym. The brain likes repetitions in various forms in order for it to
Mm.
begin to solidify these patterns. And so what we're going to stop doing is watering and fertilizing the old way of being. So this old tree, like you said, it has been strong and well developed. But if we stop today fertilizing and watering it, meaning we're no longer going to think that way, feel that way, or act that way, because every time we do, it's like watering and fertilizing it again. That same root pattern, neurotransmission goes through it, and it fertilizes it. Okay, makes it even a little bit stronger. But if we stop doing that and start being this new person, then we're watering and fertilizing the new tree. And
Mm.
so, what happens with a living thing when you stop watering and fertilizing it? It begins to weaken, and over time will grow dormant, and maybe eventually even fall over, out of the ground, because it's just never gotten any more water or fertilizer. And so all the while, we are watering and fertilizing the nutrient. And so if you are diligent about staying in this new person, in this new identity, and everything you're doing is in support of that and in reinforcement of that, I would tell you, and you structured your life around that, I would tell you that within 90 days, you would be well on the way of moving what feels like effort and focus and concentration and attention on having to think about trying to be this new person. By the end of 90 days, you are no longer having to think about it, and it has begun to move from the front part of your brain, which is where all the thinking and focus and attention resides.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what feels hard, is when it's up in that part of our brain, because that requires a lot of energy. And it begins to move to the back part of our brain, where brushing the teeth resides, where riding the bike resides, all these automatic patterns that we learned long ago that we no longer even have to think about, these new ways of being will begin to move there and become automatic. And they will begin, and then the patterns that had developed, the old ones of the old root tree, synaptic pruning will take place, where if you're not using certain neurons and certain pathways, the brain actually prunes them and gets rid of things that we don't need anymore because we're not utilizing them. That's why we forget certain memories, is because the brain deems them not important because we're not bringing them forward. And so if it says not important, I don't want to waste resources on maintaining them, so we're going to prune them. And then the lymphatic system in the middle of the night while we're sleeping sends fluid up into our brain and pulls out all those old, wasted, pruned pathways and gets rid of them. And so that's the brain's automatic cleansing system. And so that's really what this looks like, is depending on how much motivation you bring, how much commitment, how focused you are on being this new person. In my coaching, I tell people, we're looking at a fairly complete transformation in 90 days. There may be other things that you're adding on, right, as time goes on, but you are well on the way to becoming a new person, and you can self-manage yourself. You know enough that when old things pop up out of the blue that aren't helpful, that maybe it's this old pattern that surfaces because you're just highly stressed out in the moment. And that's when these old patterns tend to re-arise again, is when you're just, something triggers you. It's a moment of stress. And because the brain is geared for survival, it's going to go pull that previous concept of how you were at that moment in the past and bring it forward as an option. And that's the way the brain works, is it goes and grabs memories based on what you're experiencing today, based on the conditions that you're in, and says, this is how we think you should act, feel, and behave now, because this is how you've done it in the past.
Because we saw that before. That
Yeah.
that really speaks to something you said earlier around when you're going through the period of change, it being something that's stuck in the front, because that's you're really relearning or learning a different way to do things. And then it
Yeah.
feels like then from that, as things move towards the back of the brain, we're going into that automatic phase. And that's really where you are able to not have to think about it. It's predictive for the brain and becomes more comfortable for it to participate with when it moves to that fashion. And
Yeah,
so
it becomes a habit. It's becoming a habit at that point. Yeah.
I could imagine that if you are you're making the remodeling of the brain, that there are times that stress may trigger reactivation of something that's in the automatic portion. But the farther you get along with the remodeling, the fewer those things are going to be sitting there. And so you start to behave more naturally in the new fashion as you've gotten farther along in the process.
You're you're exactly 100% correct. And there's one additional component that's important, and that is the reward component. So
Mm.
the brain loves reward. That's what the neurochemicals are all about, right? The feel-good neurochemicals, the dopamines, the serotonins, the endorphins, the oxytocins. So that's why addiction is so heinous, because those things are so dopamine intensive that the brain becomes locked into them because it can't find that amount of pleasure anywhere else in any other form of life pleasure that we would normally do naturally. So that's why addiction becomes so heinous. But back to your point, that if you can convince the brain, and the brain will become convinced just based on how in alignment you are, that this new way of being, this new identity that you've created for yourself, is more rewarding than the old way, then it will naturally orient itself towards the new thoughts, feelings, and behaviors because they're more rewarding. So the brain chases reward. So if the old patterns were not rewarding, they were uncomfortable, they were unhelpful, they were unwanted, then your brain doesn't really want to go there because it's not rewarding, but it goes there because it's predictable and it's what it knows, it's what you've shown it. But if you show it a new way that is more rewarding because you're calmer, more satisfied, so on and so forth, then it will want to go there, because it's more pleasurable, right? And so that's the whole key here is to tie this new way of being to reward. And so the most powerful forms of reward are intrinsic rewards. So intrinsic rewards, meeting your psychological needs, being proud, the feelings of achievement, accomplishment, loving relationships, all of that stuff are deeply rewarding. We're actually, humans are hardwired to enjoy those types of things. If our new life is built around those things, then our brain will naturally pull those in favor of other memories that are not rewarding. But the key is to make sure that these new ways of being really jive with what makes us tick internally.
So it feels like once you start to identify that this is not how I want to be, then you likely can self-identify some traits that are maybe not ideal, but you probably benefit from having help to identify those things that are constructive versus those things that are destructive. Then you've made this conscious decision that you're going to work on these things that are constructive. You have this period of time where the brain is remodeling. It's doing its thing with plasticity to try to get you for you to try to get to a better behavior. And in the process, you lose those old behaviors. And in the end, you have to continue to work on making sure that you are reinforcing those good behaviors. But the brain also likes that because it's become a little bit more predictable, and there's a positive reward at the end of that. And so overall, it provides that positive reinforcement that you need to help continue to build that behavior.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's one additional component I'll add, and that is when we're identifying the unhelpful patterns that exist today, what we do is we deconstruct them, meaning we break it into pieces to understand the constructs of what's underneath and holding up these patterns and where they originated from.
Mm.
So, we just talk a lot, and that's where a coach like me asks a lot of questions, have the individual explain where they think this pattern originated from. And generally, it's like way back, in childhood, where some form of this began to develop. And then what we have to do is, in order to move to a new construction, and these patterns are constructed and tethered together with thought, emotion, and actions, all kind of tethered together, right? Because it's very rare that it's just an emotion. It's usually a thought comes with an emotion, and then the idea for an action or a behavior joins that. Like it's
Mm.
so if you get angry, like if something triggers you and ticks you off repeatedly, like you're feeling the emotion of anger, you're having these negative thoughts, and you may be lashing out. Okay, that's a behavior, a thought, an emotion, all wrapped up together, right? Okay, so we figure out where it came from, and that moment where the individual begins to understand this thing that they keep reenacting day after day, week after week, month, year after year, from years, and they kindly finally get to the realization that it started way back there. The amount of insight and epiphany that occurs in someone when they recognize that what they're doing today has originations and seeds from way back when, it's mind-blowing for people. So then we have to say, okay, obviously this is a very ingrained pattern, a very deeply held root in the ground. And so we have to loosen our grip on it. We have to then find evidence as to why it no longer is valid today. We have to, so it's almost like you pull this jar out of your pantry and you can't turn the lid off of it because it's stuck. And so you have to tap it on the countertop to get it to loosen. And that's what we're doing with these patterns, is trying to get the grip, the glue on them to loosen and weaken so that we can get rid of so that our mind then becomes open to forming a different pattern in relation to what this
Makes
pattern
sense.
keeps arising over. And so because if you're stuck to it, if in typically it's the emotion that is the glue that sticks it. And so emotions are really powerful. So if we can somehow get our grip loosened on this pattern, then our mind begins to open up to alternatives. Okay, well, I can see why it's not serving me. I can see why it's not true today. I can see how much this is costing me in my life today. And all of a sudden the grip starts to loosen. And then we can say, okay, now this new person you want to be, how would they think, feel, and act in this situation? And then we diagram it. And then we say, okay, here's a stake in the ground. And we're no longer going to water and fertilize this old pattern. We're going to start watering, fertilizing the little seeds here that we've just planted about how this new person's going to engage in this triggering situation that keeps triggering this pattern. This is how we're going to respond now. Mm-hmm. And it feels weird at the beginning because, again, it's new. It's in the front part of our brain. We're having to focus on it, pay attention to it, use willpower to get through it. And that's the hard part of that. What feels hard, that willpower component, is actually the brain having to use a bunch of resources, because the front part of our brain uses 40% of all the resources that our brain uses. So the brain uses 25% of our calories, and that front part uses 40% of the 25%. Okay, that's what causes it to feel hard. But that's really the process of deconstructing, loosening the grip, and then reconstructing, and then you practice over and over and over again being, those patterns until they start to become more automatic.
Well, George, as we've talked about of this, I mean, I think we've scratched the surface, because I feel like there's so much to think about in the methods that you use, the outcome that you're trying to achieve, how you maintain things. If people are interested in learning more or finding you to learn more, how do they do that?
Yeah, I have a website, georgehaymaker.com, and obviously there's information about the programs I offer and just more information about the approach. And there's a link on there for a discovery call, which is free, where we can talk for 30 minutes and just have you tell me about what's going on with you in your life and see if neuroscience education and coaching can help you, see if we're a fit to work together. And I will tell you that I'm a little partial and biased, but if you're seeking help and that help does not cause physiological change in the brain at the neuron level, meaning what you're doing is not causing the brain to remap itself, then those changes will not stick. They will not be sustainable, because the brain's mapping and pattern is a reflection on the thoughts and feelings and actions that you're putting out there. And so until the brain actually shifts and remaps itself, these changes won't be transformed and sustainable. And so that's where I think neuroscience coaching is uniquely qualified, is we know how to approach this change so that it is long-lasting, sustainable, life-changing, transformative. So you won't have to keep dealing with this stuff over and over and over again. Like, none of us wants to go through the challenge of change if it's not going to stick, or we don't think it's going to stick, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So my website, or you can find me also on LinkedIn.
Well, I really appreciate you again spending some time with us, because I think this is really important work, and I think the topic is absolutely fascinating. And so I look forward to learning more myself, and I always like to revisit topics as I get more knowledge in them. And so don't be surprised if you get a ring from me saying, "Hey, can we talk again?" Because I really want to make sure that I'm understanding, and I think it's really important that the listener does too.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed it. You've been a great host, and the environment's very comfortable. And I hope everyone that's listening got at least something out of today.
I'm sure they did. George, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you've made it this far, then I have to thank you for your time. I hope you've learned something new and enjoyed listening to the discussion as much as I enjoyed having it. I'd love to hear from you about the show because we're working really hard to bring you great content, and the feedback really helps us get better. If you like what you've heard or watched, for those of you who are streaming out on YouTube, then take a split second to give us a thumbs up or a like. It really helps other people like you find the show too. And no one likes to miss out on the good stuff, so go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't have to wonder when or if there's a new episode. And until next time, stay remarkable.